The 1960s were basically when old-school Hollywood finally ended. Some great directors from the golden age, like Billy Wilder, were winding down, still making good movies, but their biggest hits were behind them. And new guys like Peter Bogdanovich were just getting started. Black and white was still a thing, but color was taking over fast. But even though these movies are now over 50 years old, doesn't mean they're outdated. Actually, some of these are still really damn good. Jack Smite isn't exactly a household name today, but he directed huge stars. Paul Newman, Warren Beatty, Charlton Heston, all those guys. This time he's got Rod Steiger playing a serial killer who disguises himself in different costumes, fooling his victims one by one. Plus Lee Remick and George Segal, who's always great. It's based on a book by William Goldman, the same legendary writer who did stuff like Butch Cassidy and All the President's Men. Funny story, actor Cliff Robertson originally read an early version of Goldman's novel, liked it, and hired Goldman to adapt Flowers for Algernon. Robertson didn't like Goldman's script, though, and passed on it. Goldman shrugged, moved on, and ended up adapting the Paul Newman film Harper instead, which was also directed by Smite. The whole thing definitely feels like a 60s movie, no doubt about it, but in a good way. Smart, tense, great performances, totally entertaining start to finish. James Cagney, one of the great old-school gangster movie stars, playing a fast-talking executive for Coca-Cola. Directed by Billy Wilder, this film is about as far from Cagney's early gangster roles as you could imagine. Cagney wasn't just gangster roles, actually. He won an Oscar playing Broadway legend George Cohan in Yankee Doodle Dandy. Actually started his career in vaudeville and clearly had range to do basically anything, including great comedy, like this movie. Billy Wilder, meanwhile, was coming off a string of all-time classics, from Double Indemnity to The Apartment, which had just won Best Picture. So expectations were pretty high. But even though 1, 2, 3 didn't quite hit big with audiences at the time, it's a genuinely funny, fast, clever movie, and it shows perfectly just how versatile Cagney really was. Rock Hudson was pretty much your textbook Hollywood star. Handsome guy, romantic lead, huge star power. So this movie was completely out of character for him, a weird, psychological horror flick directed by John Frankenheimer, the guy who did The Manchurian Candidate and 7 Days in May. Shot by James Wong Howe, legendary cinematographer, won 2 Oscars, the visuals alone make this worth watching. Hudson took this role to get away from the usual romantic comedy stuff and prove he had real acting chops. He definitely proved it. But audiences back then didn't get it. Bombed at the box office, critics trashed it. It was way too ahead of its time. Years later, though, people started discovering it, and now it's a cult favorite. Even Bong Joon-ho, the director of Parasite, Oscar winner for Best Picture in 2019, has praised it publicly. Watching it now, it's crazy to think it ever got ignored. You probably remember Crimson Tide, right? Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman facing off on a submarine. Well, back in the 60s, Sidney Poitier and Richard Widmark did something pretty similar aboard the USS Bedford. It was directed by James B. Harris, his very first film. But before directing, he was Stanley Kubrick's producing partner on classics like Paths of Glory and Lolita. Basically, Harris wanted to make a serious drama about nuclear tensions, while Kubrick went off and made Dr. Strangelove, a movie poking fun at exactly the same thing. Harris's film plays it completely straight, with a genuinely shocking ending you won't see coming. And keep your eyes open for a really young Donald Sutherland in one of his earliest movie appearances. Poitier and Widmark were incredible together. It's kind of wild they never paired up again, but that makes this movie even more special. Based on a Broadway play, this movie stars Audrey Hepburn as a blind woman who unknowingly gets tangled up with a bunch of criminals, especially Alan Arkin, who pretends to be different people to trick her. Richard Crenna also pops up here, way before becoming Colonel Trautman in the Rambo films. The American Film Institute actually put it on their list of 100 thrills and ranked it above classics like Halloween, The Matrix, and The Sixth Sense. Part of that's thanks to Henry Mancini's creepy, super unusual score. But there's one moment that's especially unforgettable. near the climax when all the lights go out and the screen turns completely black. Theaters back then actually turned off the house lights to make it pitch dark and crank up the suspense even further. Years later, in 1998, the play came back on Broadway starring Marisa Tomei and Quentin Tarantino, and it got absolutely destroyed by critics. Just didn't hold up to this original film, which remains a seriously tense, super effective hidden gem, mainly because of Hepburn's incredible performance and non-stop suspense. Peter Bogdanovich, legendary director, actually got his start with this movie, and he had an amazing condition for making it. Roger Corman, who produced it, basically said Bogdanovich could do whatever he wanted, as long as Boris Karloff showed up for exactly 2 days of filming. Karloff, of course, was best known as Frankenstein's monster in all those old horror flicks. Here he plays an aging horror actor, which makes total sense. The story has him crossing paths with another character, a seemingly normal guy who suddenly snaps and starts randomly shooting people. Bogdanovich didn't just direct, he did pretty much everything: directing, writing, producing, editing, even acting. To get around the limited Karloff schedule, Bogdanovich cleverly used footage from Karloff's older movies, like Corman's own film The Terror, which starred Jack Nicholson. It's honestly different from everything Bogdanovich did later, but it's still fantastic. Right from the start, he was clearly a filmmaker who knew exactly what he was doing. Based on a short story by John Cheever, this is not your typical 60s movie. Burt Lancaster stars as a guy who literally swims home pool by pool across his neighborhood, meeting different people along the way. Ironically, Lancaster was actually terrified of water, so he had to take swimming lessons just to deal with being wet all day during filming. This was also one of Frank Perry's early films as director. Perry later did Mommie Dearest, the infamous movie where Faye Dunaway plays Joan Crawford. Look closely. Legendary comedian Joan Rivers pops up here briefly too. Jack Smite's back again on this list, this time with Paul Newman playing Private Eye Lou Harper. Newman's hired to track down a missing millionaire, and the cast is packed. Robert Wagner, Janet Leigh, Shelley Winters, even Lauren Bacall. The movie's based on Ross MacDonald's novel The Moving Target. MacDonald actually wrote several books featuring the same character, though in those novels his name is Lou Archer. Screenwriter William Goldman adapted this story, mostly because he loved MacDonald's detective series. Lauren Bacall being here is basically a tribute to the detective movies her husband Humphrey Bogart used to star in, like The Maltese Falcon, where he played Sam Spade. Newman would play Harper again 9 years later in The Drowning Pool. Movies about private detectives were huge in Hollywood history, and this one is still easily one of the best of its era. Robert Wise was already a legendary director. He'd made classics like West Side Story and The Sound of Music. After that last huge success, he directed something totally different. This epic story set in 1920s China in the middle of political turmoil. Steve McQueen stars as an engineer aboard a ship nicknamed the Sand Pebble. Also in the cast, Richard Crenna, Candice Bergen, way before Murphy Brown, and veteran character actor James Hong, who recently popped up in Everything Everywhere All at Once. And we can't forget Richard Attenborough, who later won 2 Oscars directing Gandhi, but most people know him as John Hammond, the old guy from Jurassic Park. He gives a great performance here too, winning a Golden Globe. The Sand Pebbles ended up with 8 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, Actor for McQueen, and Jerry Goldsmith's great score. But weirdly, Robert Wise didn't get nominated for Best Director. Still, as the only producer, Wise was the one who'd accept the Best Picture award if they won. Unfortunately, no Oscars came their way, but still, great movie, great performances, definitely holds up. Director Blake Edwards usually gets remembered for comedy, especially those Pink Panther movies with Peter Sellers. But before he got big into comedy, Edwards tackled something really serious with this one: alcoholism. Jack Lemmon stars, playing completely against type. Nothing funny here. Lemmon's an alcoholic who pulls his wife, played brilliantly by Lee Remick, down with him. What makes it stand out is how incredibly real the performances feel. Like there's a scene where Lemmon desperately tears apart a greenhouse trying to find a bottle he hid. It's raw and painful, just completely believable. Both Lemon and Remick got a bunch of award nominations for this, and Henry Mancini, Edwards' frequent collaborator and the guy who gave us the famous Pink Panther theme, won an Oscar and a Grammy for his music. When people talk about great alcoholism movies, they usually mention stuff like The Lost Weekend or Leaving Las Vegas, but this one is just as good, if not better. One of the absolute best movies ever made about addiction.